Hello, everyone. Welcome. So, today we continue on our Orientalism journey. I hope you're all well and everything is going fine. So, today we start chapter 2, Orientalist Structures and Restructures. So, he starts with a quote by Edward William Lane from an account of the manners and customs of the modern Egyptians. When the Sayyid Omar, the Naqib al-Ashraf, or chief of the descendants of the Prophet, peace be upon him, married a daughter about 45 years since, there walked before the procession a young man who had made an incision in his abdomen and drawn out a large portion of his intestines, which he carried before him on a silver tray. After the procession, he restored them to their proper place and remained in bed many days before he recovered from the effects of this foolish and disgusting act. And then he goes to a French quote by Alphonse de Lamartine from Voyages to the Orient, which I will not read because my French is atrocious. Thank you for the likes. Keep on tapping the screen and sharing the live out. Part 1. Redrawn frontiers, redefined issues, secularized religion. Gustave Flaubert died in 1880 without having finished Bouvard de Pochon, his comic encyclopedic novel on the degeneration of knowledge and the inanity of human effort. Nevertheless, let me get my tongue together. Nevertheless, the essential outlines of his vision are clear, and are clearly supported by the ample detail in this novel. Two clerks are members of the bourgeoisie who, because one of them is the unexpected beneficiary of a handsome will, retire from the city to spend their lives on a country estate doing what they please. As Flaubert portrays the experience, doing as they please involves Bouvard and Pochon in a practical and theoretical jaunt through agriculture, history, chemistry, education, archaeology, literature, always with less than successful results. They move through fields of learning like travelers in time and knowledge, experiencing disappointment, disaster, and letdowns of uninspired amateurs. What they move through, in fact, is the whole disillusioning experience of the 19th century, whereby, in Charles Maurraset's phrase, les bourgeois coquerants turns out to be the bumbling victims of their own leveling incompetence and mediocrity. I like that he says that, because Western mediocrity is so often celebrated as something to aspire to. Every enthusiasm resolves itself into boring cliché, and every discipline or type of knowledge changes from hope and power into disorder, ruin, and sorrow. Among Flaubert's sketches for the conclusion of this panorama of despair are two items of special interest to us here. The two men debate the future of mankind. Péchuan sees the future of humanity through a glass darkly, whereas Bouvard sees it brightly. Modern man is progressing. Europe will be regenerated by Asia. The historical law that civilization moves from Orient to Occident. The two forms of humanity will at last be soldered together. This is from the book. This obvious echo of Quinet represents the start of still another of the cycles of enthusiasm and disillusionment, through which the two men will pass. His notes indicate that, like this anticipated project of Bouvard's is rudely interrupted by reality, this time by a sudden appearance of gendarmes. Gendarmes? I don't know what that word means. Thank you for the follow. or a paramilitary officer in France and other French-speaking countries, who accuse him of debauchery. A few lines later, however, the second item of interest turns up. The two men simultaneously confess to each other that their secret desire is once again to become copyists. They have a double desk made for them. They buy books, pencils, erasers, and, as Flaubert concludes the sketch, ils s'y mettent. They turn to from trying to live through and apply knowledge more or less directly. They are reduced finally to transcribing it uncritically from one text to another. And this is quite important to know about humankind, is that, and this is something that I've been trying to explain to my husband forever, the concept of postmodernism, that everything has already been done, and we are just reiterating already understood terms and reinventing art and cycles of humanity that have already been done and gone through. But essentially, this kind of copyism, as he calls it here, is essentially what human history has been reduced to consistently. That we are just copying everything that has been done before, and a lot of people copy things directly because they either lack the imagination or the experience or the knowledge to continue from which to come up with entirely something new. Although Bouvard's vision of Europe regenerated by Asia is not fully spelled out, and what it comes to on the copyist desk can be glossed in several important ways. Like many of the two men's other visions, this one is global, reconstructive, representing what Flaubert felt to be the 19th century predilection for the rebuilding of the world according to an imaginative vision, sometimes accompanied by special scientific techniques. Among the visions Flaubert has in mind are the utopias of Saint-Simon and Fourier, the scientific regenerations of mankind envisioned by Comte, and all technical or secular religions promoted by ideologues, positivists, eclectics, occultists, traditionalists, and idealists such as de Tracy, Cabanilles, Michelet, Cousin, Proudhon, Cournot, Cabet, Janet, and Lemennais. Throughout the novel, the two espouse the various causes of such figures, and having ruined them, they move on looking for newer ones, but with no better results. So there's absolutely no way that people who have been fed knowledge but have not had the experience to think differently or see things differently will consistently water down what has already been written or understood by somebody else, because we're constantly saying, hey, in layman's terms, this is what they're saying. I cannot write a new book on Orientalism. I can't go into those ideas without actually having experienced the things that Edward Saïd has experienced. And if I don't, excuse me, and if I don't have my own experiences and do my own research outside of Edward Saïd's version of Orientalism, I will forever be stuck in a watered down version in my head of this work. The roots of such revisionist ambitions as these are romantic in a very specific way. We must remember the extent to which a major part of the spiritual and intellectual project of the late 18th century was reconstituted theology, natural supernaturalism, as Abrams called it. This type of thought is carried forward by the typical 19th century attitudes that Flaubert satirizes. The notion of regeneration therefore harks back to a conspicuous romantic tendency after the rationalism and decorum of the Enlightenment to revert to the stark drama and super-rational mysteries of Christian stories and doctrines, and to the violent conflicts and abrupt reversals of the Christian inner life, turning on the extremes of destruction and creation, hell and heaven, exile and reunion, death and rebirth, dejection and joy, paradise lost and paradise gained. But since they lived inescapably after the Enlightenment, Romantic writers revived these ancient matters with a difference. They undertook to save the overview of human history and destiny, the existential paradigms, the cardinal values of their religious heritage, reconstituting them in a way that would make them intellectually acceptable, as well as emotionally pertinent for the time being. And this is how we get revisionist history. This is how we get history that has not exactly been true to what happened. We get a history that is romanticized. We get a history that whitewashes. Because if you're always aiming to do something to make it look better, you realize, oh God, what have we done? And then rewrite it to make it a lot better. Make yourself seem a bit better. To say, hey, what we did here is bad, so let's take it out. What Bouvard has in mind, the regeneration of Europe by Asia, was an influential romantic idea. Friedrich Schlegel and Novalis, for example, urged upon their countrymen, and upon Europeans in general, a detailed study of India because they said it was Indian culture and religion that could defeat the materialism and mechanism, as well as republicanism, of Occidental culture. And from this defeat would rise a new, revitalized Europe. The biblical imagery of death, rebirth, and redemption is evident in this prescription. The Romantic Orientalist project was not merely a specific instance of general tendency. It was a powerful shaper of the tendency itself, as Raymond Schwab has so convincingly argued in La Renaissance Orientale. But what mattered was not Asia so much as Asia's use to modern Europe. And this is not talking about resources, because resources was always something that Europe just took. This was an ideological influence. Thus, anyone who, like Schlegel or Franz Bopp, mastered an Oriental language was a spiritual hero, a knight-errant, bringing back to Europe a sense of the holy mission it had lost. It's precisely this sense that the later secular religions portrayed by Flaubert carry on in the 19th century. No less than Schlegel, Wordsworth, and Chateaubriand, Auguste Comte, like Bouvard, was the adherent and proponent of a secular post-Enlightenment myth whose outlines are unmistakably Christian. I want you to think about something that is similar to this nowadays. In regularly allowing the two characters to go through revisionist notions from start to comically debased finish, Flaubert drew attention to the human flaw common to all projects. He saw perfectly that underneath these rescued ideas of Europe regenerated by Asia lurked in insidious hubris. Neither Europe nor Asia was anything without the visionary's technique for turning vast geographical domains into treatable, manageable entities, and thus they needed to be ruled over. At bottom, therefore, Europe and Asia were our Europe and our Asia, our will, our representation, as Schopenhauer said. Historical laws were in reality historians' laws, because it just depends who writes it, right? Just as the two forms of humanity drew attention less to actuality than to a European capacity for lending man-made distinctions an air of inevitability. As for the other half of the phrase, will at last be soldered together, he mocked the blithe indifference of science and actuality, a science which anatomized and melted human entities as if they were so much inert matter. But it wasn't just any science he mocked. It was enthusiastic, even messianic European science, whose victories included failed revolutions, wars, oppression, and unteachable appetites for putting grand, bookish ideas quixotically to work immediately. What such science or knowledge never reckoned with was its own deeply ingrained, unself-conscious bad innocence and the resistance to it of reality. And Europe has never had a way of looking at reality for what it is. Europe has always looked at everywhere else in the world in relation to itself, in relation to what it can gain, in relation to what it already understands. When Bouvard plays the scientist, he naively assumes that science merely is, that reality is the science as the scientist says it is, that it doesn't matter whether the scientist is a fool or a visionary, or he or anyone who thinks like him cannot see that the Orient may not wish to regenerate Europe, or that Europe was not about to fuse itself democratically with yellow or brown Asians. Oof, I don't like these terms. In short, such a scientist does not recognize in his science the egoistic power that feeds his endeavors and corrupts his ambitions. The European scientist has never looked upon something different and said, wow, I need to understand it as it is. No, I need to take it apart and understand it by my own reference. Flaubert, of course, sees to it that his poor fools are made to rub their noses in these difficulties. The characters have learnt that it is better not to traffic in ideas and in reality altogether. The novel's conclusion is a picture of the two of them now perfectly content to copy their favorite ideas faithfully from book onto paper. Knowledge no longer requires application. Knowledge is what gets passed on silently, without comment from one text to another. It's all just regurgitating old ideas. Ideas are propagated and disseminated anonymously, repeated without attribution. They have literally become rescued ideas. What matters is that they are there, repeated, echoed, and re-echoed uncritically. Any questions so far? In a highly compressed form of this brief episode, taking out of Flaubert's notes, frames the specifically modern structures of Orientalism, which, after all, is one discipline among the secular and quasi-religious faiths of the 19th century and in European thought. We have already categorized the general scope of thought about the Orient that was handed on through the medieval and Renaissance periods, for which Islam was the essential Orient. During the 18th century, however, there were a number of new interlocking elements that hinted at the coming evangelical phase, whose outlines Flaubert was later to recreate. For one, the Orient was being opened out considerably beyond the Islamic lands. The quantitative change was, to a large degree, the result of continuing and expanding European exploration of the rest of the world, the increasing influence of travel literature, imaginary utopias, moral voyages, and scientific reporting that brought the Orient into sharper and more extended focus. If Orientalism is indebted principally to the fruitful European discoveries of Anquetil and Jones during the latter third of the century, these must have seen the wider context created by Cook and Bougainville, the voyages of Tournefort and Addison, by President de Brosses' Histoire de Navigation aux Terres Australes, by French traders in the Pacific, by Jesuit missionaries in China and the Americas, by William Dampierre's explorations and reports, and innumerable speculations on giants, Patagonians, savages, natives, and monsters supposedly residing to the far east, west, south, and north of Europe. But all such widening horizons had Europe firmly in the privileged center as main observer, or mainly observed, as in Goldsmith's Citizen of the World. For even as Europe moved itself outward, its sense of cultural strength was fortified, from travellers' tales, and not only from great institutions like the various Indian companies. Colonies were created and ethnocentric perspectives secured. It was always done in an ethnocentric fashion. For another, a more knowledgeable attitude towards the alien and exotic was abetted not only by travellers and explorers, but by historians, for whom European experiences could profitably be compared with another, as well as older civilizations. That powerful current in 18th century historical anthropology, described by scholars as the confrontation of the gods, meant that Gibbon could read the lessons of Rome's decline and the rise of Islam, just as Vico could understand modern civilization in terms of the barbaric, poetic splendor of their earliest beginnings. Whereas Renaissance historians judged the Orient inflexibly as an enemy whose 18th century confronted the Oriental peculiarities with some detachment and with some attempt at dealing directly with Oriental source material, perhaps such a technique helped the European to know himself better. And I am feeling very switchy right now. My brain is not focusing very well. So I'm going to end that here. I am so sorry, it is only half an hour. But my brain is not cooperating. And I need to take care of myself.